Hello, my name is Clara Timre. I work for the Department of Social Geography and Regional Development Planning at the University of Debrecen in Hungary. As a partner institution in the enacted project funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, together with an international team of colleagues, we elaborated an online course material entitled the European Neighbourhood Policy and Cross-Border Cooperation. My task was to provide study materials for you focusing on the general introduction to borders and cross-border cooperations in Unit 3. Let me guide you through the slides to help you getting acquainted with the topic more thoroughly. Borders are integral parts of our everyday lives from our birth or even before. They can be personal, social, political, economic, mental, physical, natural or artificial. It really depends on us, how we see them, how we approach them. It also depends on us whether we see these borders as positive or negative, or we find them useful or useless. Some nations have more than one word for the border phenomenon, and they use different terms for the different approaches. Some people feel the weight and burden of borders in their everyday lives, while on others they have no impact at all. It depends where they live, in which part of the world they are living. In Europe, the issue of borders has become of special relevance as a result of the disappearance of the Iron Curtain and the European Union's goal of removing all borders that inhibit life or work in the common European space. Therefore, there are parts in Europe or parts of Europe where the population aged under 25 has never experienced what it is like not to be able to travel free around the continent. Every nation has its own set of terms used for the borders of their own country. The terminology thus varies country by country. Nevertheless, the meaning and contents of these terms are the products of history, which have changed a lot as the integration processes accelerated on our continent. Therefore, in Europe, and slowly all over the world, more and more new border-related terms are introduced, which shift the original meaning of borders and add a new dimension to them. The nature of cross-border relations and cross-border cooperations is clearly produced by the will of people and will of powers, and strengthen the connecting nature of borders as opposed to their separating role. Nowadays, the enlargement issue is in the focus of all disciplines. Geography, history, economics, law, sociology, political sciences, and many other disciplines keep referring to and relying on the institutional systems and processes of the European Union when selecting research topics. Naturally, the researchers can provide a pragmatic image of reality only if they get to know each other thoroughly and endeavor at complementing one another. The research is focusing on borders, border region, and cross-border cooperations within this interdisciplinary issue contain the most spectacular elements of the bottom-up approach in the creation of the institutional system. The so-called Euro-regions, lying along the internal as well as the external borders of the European Union member states, cover the regions almost like building elements, like a Lego. Taking all these into consideration, we may establish that cross-border cooperations may be found on all fields and all levels of the economic, social, or political, as well as everyday life. Every country in the world and all disciplines in sciences have their own definition for borders, border regions, and even for cross-border regions or cross-border cooperations. As the module focuses on Europe and its policies, therefore the emphasis is on the interpretation of these terms from the aspect of Europe, and more especially from the point of view of the European Union. Let us start with a short activity. Click on the image to start an about 12-minute long video about the borders and populations of each country in Europe for every year since 400 BC. If you have difficulties to start the video, please try one of the links below the image. After watching the video, please devote some time to the analysis of the changes in the position of length of state borders in Europe and try to find answers for yourself to the following questions. First, what kind of consequences do you think these past or historical border changes had on the current cooperations within Europe? Second, why is it useful to understand the past of international borders? And third, try to find relationships between the changes of borders and the intensity of cooperations in Europe. When you finished with the activity, please go on to the next slide. Perhaps the most often heard and most well-known expressions related to the interpretation of borders in the European Union are borderless Europe or Europe without borders. Well, why do we talk about the lack of borders? Why is it so important to find a way to get rid of or to overcome international borders? By definition, we all know that international borders demarcate the space between sovereign states. Within the borders, a state government has total authority which cannot be impeded by other governments. However, in the European Union, at present there are 27 countries with 27 governments cooperating, sharing powers, providing a framework, and being part of an integration whose aim is to act within a single space. To understand the above phenomenon, first it must be accepted that there are different types of international borders in the European Union, depending not only on their impacts on culture, politics, ethnic composition, social processes or economic performance, but also depending on their location or position within the area of the European Union. Strictly speaking, there are two basic types of borders on the area of Europe from the aspect of the European Union. There are EU internal borders and EU external borders. Some EU member states have only internal borders, while others have both. During the history of the European Union, most of the member states experienced having external borders for a shorter or longer period as a consequence of the enlargement processes. Another aspect to differentiate between borders in the EU is whether it is a land border or a maritime border. At present, calculating without the mini-states, there are 35 internal land borders with a total length of 16,075 kilometers and 31 external land borders with a length of 11,740 kilometers on the area of the European Union. For comparison, the ratios of internal and external borders have reversed both in number and length since the creation of the integration by the 6 founding states in the late 1950s. The figure on the right shows you the stages of these changes. Let us shift now to the question of border regions. In the European Union, most border regions are defined as regions which have part of their territory demarcated by an international border. However, due to the use of the administrative structure for analytical as well as redistributional purposes, the definition also includes the criterion of being not 3-level, and thus border regions are more precisely defined as not 3-level regions located along or very close to land borders. Another important element of the EU definition of border regions is related to the position of the border region within the area of the European Union. In this respect, the two main types are internal border regions and external border regions. Internal border regions are those regions which are located along borders between EU member states and or EFTA countries, while external border regions are located along borders between EU member states and non-member countries, excluding EFTA countries, of course. However, border regions in the EU definition take into consideration also the fact that border effects are likely to diminish as a function of the distance from a border. Therefore, the most complete definition of border regions in the EU glossary also includes those regions which, although not being demarcated by an international border, are located within 25 kilometers of a border. Talking about the topic very simply, we may say that if you cross the existing international borders, or if the border regions cooperate with each other, then it will surely result in the phenomenon of cross-border cooperation. However, it is a little bit more than that. Cross-border cooperation is the process of working or acting together for a common purpose or benefit across borders of two or more countries. The European Commission, in its glossary related to the fifth enlargement, defined cross-border cooperation as cross-border cooperations under the PHARE program aimed to encourage economic convergence through integration and thus to prevent the creation of economically less favored peripheral zones. It concerned the management of the candidate countries' border regions with neighboring countries. Furthermore, the European Commission made a distinction between direct or transnational and indirect cross-border cooperations. Direct cross-border cooperation is a form of collaboration of different countries, regions, sharing the same border, intended to yield benefits and reach common goals. While indirect cross-border cooperation is a form of collaboration of different countries, regions across borders that are not necessarily shared borders. Relying on the above, Sonja Gerfeld proposed the following definition in 2009. Cross-border cooperation is a form of international cooperation exercised bilaterally or multilaterally between countries or regions across shared and not shared borders to yield benefits or reach common goals. Based on the above, it may be established that taking into consideration the European Union and the European integration processes, cross-border cooperation is understood as cooperation and collaboration between local and regional authorities on the two sides of a national border, aiming at the joint management of various activities. The study of the types of cross-border regions allows for several approaches, from the scientific point of view analyzing theoretical models, representing the deductive approach, to the practical point of view, comparing individual border characteristics for setting up categorizing methods, which can be actually considered as the inductive approach. Various aspects are available by which cross-border regions and cross-border cooperations can be distinguished from each other. The possible ways for differentiating and typifying cross-border cooperations has great variety, starting from the simple ways of typifying up to the more complex approach, forming a basis for the overall classification of cross-border cooperations in Europe. The Committee of Regions, in its document entitled Trans-European Cooperation Between Territorial Authorities, New Challenges and Future Steps Necessary to Improve Cooperation, published in 2001, gives an excellent overview on the multitude of approaches that attempt to analyze and classify cooperation between local and regional authorities in Europe. These were developed mostly by the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, the Committee of the Regions, and researchers. Just like, as you can see it in the slide, they were responsible for different aspects of the classification and of the topic. Like, for example, the Council of Europe was responsible or is responsible for clarifying the basic terminology. The European Parliament elaborated specific reports on cross-border cooperations between local and regional authorities. Now we must take into consideration, we should never forget that setting up a category system for cross-border regions and cooperations is a very important task for being able to elaborate comparative analysis for cross-border cooperations in Europe. As a result of the unified criteria systems, the cooperations are added to the relevant systems of the European Union as individual entities, and thus they become easily accessible for the institutions involved. For instance, their role in the practice may be experienced even in the more justified and more objective approval of the financial supports. Their usefulness is also supported by the fact that the growing scope and the growing number of Euroregions and other forms of cross-border cooperations can be followed and understood more thoroughly with the help of them. Talking about typifying and categorizing border regions and cross-border regions, cross-border cooperations, now let's have a look at the scientific ways of typifying and the scientific typologies. Here we will have a look at three basic approaches. One of them is represented by Milan Buffon, who says that border areas and border regions in Europe fall into three basic groups: Western European, Central European, and Eastern European. Now, by the term region of regions, Buffon means the oldest cross-border regions in Western Europe, where the individual administrative units form an institutional cross-border interest network. A high potential level of social integration or reintegration rather characterizes the Central European border regions, usually leading to the formation of functional cross-border systems, defined Buffon as regions within regions. Now, usually spontaneous cross-border areas characterize the Central European space. And whereas the Eastern European space still has very limited possibilities of creating more intense forms of cross-border cooperation and reintegration. Therefore, Buffon says that the cross-border regions here are most often only nominal, and therefore he defined them as regions under reconstruction. The second approach is by Markus Perkman, and based on this approach, on the geographical scope, Perkman uses the term micro cross-border regions for the small-scale cooperation arrangements among contiguous border regions belonging to different nation-states. This term is used regardless of the precise organizational setup or the nature of the participating actors. The term cooperation intensity in Perkman's terminology refers to the degree to which the cross-border bodies have gained autonomy vis-à-vis the single participating authorities. For estimating the cooperation intensity, Perkman relied on the catalogue of criteria proposed by the Association of European Border Regions. Accordingly, those micro cross-border regions which have a strong organizational structure are referred to as integrated, while those which have a rather loose organizational structure, they are called emerging micro cross-border regions. In the case of the latter, we can experience the lack of permanent secretariat, or the lack of development plans, or the lack of comprehensive cooperation schemes. If the cross-border regions cover extensive areas, on the other hand, then they are either Scandinavian groupings or working communities, according to Perkman, where the main difference between the two structures lies in the intensity of cooperation, as explained before. In this respect, the Scandinavian groupings are more organized structures, while the working communities represent the emerging cooperations. Using Perkman's classification as a basis, we may say that most of the small-scale initiatives involve local authorities as the driving protagonists, whereas large-scale cross-border cooperations are almost exclusively driven by regional authorities. However, we shouldn't forget that there is a great variance in this respect, depending on the territorial organization of the different European countries. Now, the third approach is the most often applied categorizing method in the case of cross-border cooperations, operated on the institutional level, which is associated with the date of establishment of the cooperations, and this is a widely used method by the Hungarian researchers, including János Rechnitzer, Tamás Hardy, István Sülizakar, and Béla Baranyi. Many chose this method on the international level as well, which may be complemented by the geographical scope, including the area and position of the region, the cooperation intensity or the type of actors, the long or short-term development levels, or the levels of the cooperating partners and the territorial contiguity. The European Union, when defining its support program for 2007-2013, matched the support programs with the appropriate cooperation forms and introduced the institutional form of the European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation, that is EGTC. Geographically speaking, the European cross-border cooperations can be categorized with respect to their geographical location using the macro-regional level. According to the website of the DG Regional Policy, a macro-region is an area including territory from a number of different countries or regions associated with one or more common features or challenges. This means that the cross-border cooperations can be located in either Northern Europe and Baltic Sea area, or in Central and Eastern Europe, or in Northwest Europe, or in the Alpine Danubian region, or in Southwest Europe, that is in the western part of the Mediterranean region, or in Southeast Europe, meaning the eastern part of the Mediterranean region. At present, the Association of European Border Regions claims that 95 out of the approximately 163 working border and cross-border regions are members. On its website, the Association of European Border Regions distinguishes between members of the AEBR and partially members of the AEBR. Based on the geographical location and on the AEBR membership of the smaller border and cross-border regions, the Association of European Border Regions observed certain particularities and regional concentrations. You can see these in the table on the slide, where you can find the main features of the European cross-border regions by macro-regions. The Association of European Border Regions actually set up a criteria system for estimating the cooperation intensity of existing cross-border cooperation arrangements. This consists of three main criteria. One is the cooperation based on some type of legal arrangement, common permanent secretariat controlling its own resources. Second means the existence of an explicitly documented development strategy within the cross-border cooperation. And thirdly, there's a broad scope of cooperation in multiple policy areas, similar to conventional local or regional authorities. Now, cross-border cooperations may vary not only by geographical location, size, or the nature of participating regions, but their operation may be also extremely diverse, taking different forms, from simple joint meetings of existing structures to establishment of joint committees, or from legally non-binding arrangement to public law bodies. What is common in all of them is that whether informal or formal, with a legal personality under public or private law, they can be created under the provisions of national or international law. It is possible, therefore, to distinguish between four broad categories of cross-border arrangements, as you can see it in the figure in the upper left corner of the slide. Now, focusing more on a union perspective, here we must take into consideration that in the EU regional policy, the typology of borders is based on three different approaches and aspects. The EU border typology was developed by the European Commission's Director General for Regional and Urban Policy in association with Eurostat. There is a typology solely based on the distance between a border and a region, which we defined earlier, identifying three basic types of border regions in the EU, namely a land border within 25 kilometers, and non-border region. Since this EU typology is not recognized in the EU NUTS regulation, therefore the EU legislation may make use of other definitions and thus identify some additional types of border regions, such as a maritime border or a maritime border within 25 kilometers, or a land and a maritime border, and a land border within 25 kilometers and a maritime border within 25 kilometers. There are also close links between the EU border typology and the urban-rural typology, as each border region is classified either as predominantly urban or intermediate or predominantly rural border region, or even as mountain border region. In addition to the above, the position of a border in terms of the area of the EU also further divides the border regions, as they can be either internal or external border regions. Now also, we should not neglect the fact that the exact definition of border regions within the context of cross-border cooperation changes from one programming period to the other. At present, it includes supports for regions with maritime borders as well. In its Boosting Growth and Cohesion in EU Border Regions document, the European Union used the definition of border regions that is based exclusively on internal land-based borders, including borders with Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. You can see the exact geographical position of the border regions within the EU on the map on the right. In 2016, there were 463 NUTS-free border regions, of which 360 were along land borders and 103 within 25 kilometers of land borders. Also, there were 885 non-border regions. The flexible nature of definitions employed in the EU legislation is one of the main reasons why there is still no standardized definition of border regions in the legislation for territorial typologies.